Good morning. We wish to welcome you to our 15th annual symposium entitled Empathie. My name is Michelle Sones, and I'm one of the organizers of this year's symposium. And I'm very excited this morning because we have our first student panel entitled Empathy and the Archive. This conference hopes to address questions around empathy as it relates to art practice, theory, and history. We're interested in exploring the roles of the arts in bridging the gap between feelings and actions, especially regarding issues of gender, sexuality, race, class, and ability. We're also concerned with the limits of empathy and what empathy can and cannot do with regards to reconciling discrimination and privilege. I'd like to begin this morning by acknowledging that the host institution for the symposium, Concordia University, is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Ganegahaga Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters where I am in Jojage, Montreal. This is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations, and today it's home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We recognize the injustices that are part of the colonial history of this place, and we respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. We also want to acknowledge that the headquarters for Zoom, which is facilitating our virtual gathering, occupied the Mukwema Ohlone territory in what is currently known as San Jose, California. And many of you are joining us from other places on Turtle Island and around the world, and we encourage you to acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. We will be leaving the chat open for the duration of the presentation this morning. If you would like to say hello to everyone and let us know where you're tuning in from, we really appreciate that and try to create a bit of a sense of community here this morning. You can also use the chat or the Q&A function to ask questions of our panelists. Today, we are going to have 3 presenters followed by a question period moderated by Christa Nemnom. Christa is currently completing her 2nd year in the Master's of Art History at Concordia. Her research combines her interest in modern avant-gardes and sensory studies by exploring the interrelations between surrealist art, the cultural connotations of sight, and the socio-political circumstances of the early 20th century. So I'm going to hand it off to Christa now, who is going to introduce this morning's presenters.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction, Michelle. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our first panel of the day entitled Empathy and the Archive. So my name is Christa, and I will be the moderator for this session. Our panelists are Ilaria Casini, Yuma Terada, and Gabriella Teresa Moreno. I will be introducing our speakers in more depth before their respective talks, which will last between 15 and 20 minutes. And then we will end the panel with a Q&A period. So please feel free to submit your questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens throughout the talks. We'll get to them at the end. So without further ado, let's welcome our first panelist. Ilaria Casini is a recent MA graduate in Art History and Theory from UBC Vancouver and holds a first-class honors degree in Art History, Film, and Visual Culture from Aberdeen University, Scotland. Her work focuses on research-based practices engaging with systems of power, decolonial epistemologies, and the relationship between institutional infrastructures, communal care, and civic agency. Ilaria has worked for several institutions in Italy, Scotland, and Canada, assisting visitors' experience, fostering community participation, and enhancing uncomfortable conversations. In lockdown, she has also learned how to knit socks. Everyone, please welcome Ilaria.
Hi, hello everyone. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. And then we can start with the presentation. I hope that everyone can see the PowerPoint. Please, someone let me know if this is not the case. So first of all, I'd like to recognize the exceptional circumstances of this presentation, which nevertheless do not abstain me to consider how I am able to present this work through the institution of Concordia University, which is located on the traditional and unceded territory of the Ganegahaga Nation. I thus would like to first acknowledge my privilege as a guest and the limits of my perspectives as such, and express my utmost gratitude for this opportunity to all people involved. So we're going to begin with the first personal artifact. I have always loved going grocery shopping. This drawing is proof of that. It was drawn by me over 10 years ago, and it represents my high school friend Julia and I skipping class to go grocery shopping. The speech bubble refers to an inside joke about how we had never before experienced the supermarket during the morning, and its clientele made up mostly of older ladies, which of course made two high schoolers on a school day particularly stand out. This is to set the scene of my paper, but it is also to explain how this research interest came about. Moving back home to the north of Italy because of the COVID pandemic, I found myself back in my small town with not much to fill my days, as I'm sure many other people in the world. Until I discovered that a local charity had set up a service for volunteers to go buy groceries or run errands for those most vulnerable in the health crisis. Needless to say, I signed up to the service, and which takes place with no contact between the two parties. The volunteers go to the person in need's home at a determined time, and the client leaves bags, a grocery list, and money outside of their door. The volunteer then leaves the groceries at the doorstep. I think I need to clarify that everyone in my town lives in apartment buildings and not houses. Therefore, this exchange happens in the stairwells with no actual visual encounter between the two parties, which communicate only through the intercom. So in the past 5 months, I have never seen the people I've gone grocery shopping for. I've only heard their voices for quick exchanges of pleasantries, though I have spent a lot of time with their handwritings. While I might not be able to recognize them in the street someday in the future, I feel like I'm getting to know them with a particular degree of intimacy, at least the more regular ones. For the first few days, I did not put much thought into this until I was presented with a grocery list written in German and then carefully copied and translated into Italian. Here is some context. The area I live in is close to the Austrian border, and it is bilingual. People here belong to different language groups, the main ones being Italian and German, specifically an Austrian dialect. The population is thus expected to learn both languages, and I'm sure this resonates with people living and based in Montreal. Of course, this is the result of many years of cultural struggles, which developed through occupation, colonization, war, terrorism, and eventually resulted in strong power imbalances between the two cultural groups. The older generation, to which the author of this list on the PowerPoint belonged, grew up during the fascist occupation and its Italianization process, and was therefore forbidden to learn, speak, or write their native language of German for 20 years. Nevertheless, unaware of the volunteers' language group, they took time and care to translate it in order to avoid all possible assumptions and thus activate its utmost expressive potential, and unknowingly maybe charge it with even more complex meaning and purpose. This scrap of paper provoked a strong affective reaction in me, an empathetic recognition of another unique subjectivity and of historical trauma we both navigate residing in this area, and of the urgent effort to overcome the current interpersonal crisis we are living through. I thus started paying more attention to the lists I was entrusted with, analyzing them not merely as written material, but as visual representations of singular individualities and as outcomes of specific conditions of creation. This handwritten, minutely categorized, described, and even illustrated grocery lists became accidental, abstracted self-portraits.
Sorry, Ilaria, do you mind if I interrupt for a sec? I think your paper is rubbing up against your mic, so we can't hear you very well. Just be mindful of that.
Thank you. Sorry.
No problem.
So yes, this grocery list, they present a means of expression in an extreme situation, which succeeds in weaving mental and physical associations, provoking an empathic response and suggesting narratives that map different subjectivities and sketch intergenerational and intercultural affective connections. To consider them as visual material allows me to channel an art historical mode of inquiry and insert them into the frameworks of affect theory and social reproduction theory, considering thus their implication with processes of meaning and value creation, respectively. However, unlike traditional or canonical art historical research, this presentation tries to reflect on what theorist Irit Rogoff defines as the research turn. That is, to not accept research as purely working from inherited knowledges, thus building on existing scholarship as a means to validate itself, but also embracing research as a form of working from conditions. Conditions, Rogoff explains, are impacted by factors such as precariousness, sustainability, security, and these necessarily impact subjects, methodologies, and audiences of research. In this case, the conditions of my research were a very limited access to the common academic tools of research, quick intercom communication with the authors of the lists, the possibility to compare my experiences with that of other volunteers, friends, family, customers, and workers of supermarkets and produce stores, a good amount of time to think in solitude, the embodied and choreographed experience of grocery shopping, the geographical exploration of all the different supermarkets, local produce stores of my town, as recommended by the list authors, and the peculiar socio-political circumstances created by the COVID-19 pandemic. Restrictions, rules to follow, stress, anxiety, loss of physical contact, economic crisis, extreme precariousness. As audience of this research, you are impacted by these conditions as well, and not merely for the obvious reason of the online format of this presentation, but because you are also living through some of these conditions. You are impacted because the object of this presentation is not an artwork or an art practice as art historical research would like me to have one. And this might be somehow destabilizing for attendees of an art history conference. I will dwell more in the territory of visual culture and material culture, but truly the object of this presentation is the methodology of art research itself. You are impacted by this because I would like for you to participate in this methodology by sharing in the chat any thoughts, reflections, comments, or reactions the images on the slides might prompt in you throughout my talk, so that I can later on download or copy them and somehow be informed by your subjectivity and creative experiences as well. The lists on my PowerPoint come from an Instagram account called Insta della Spesa, literally Insta of groceries, an online archive of grocery lists submitted anonymously or not from all over Italy. I have titled and translated parts of the list so it might be easier for you to refer to them. Firstly, to break the ice, I would like to ask you to share in the chat your grocery list. This can be a realistic one because you need to go buy produce later today or tomorrow, or a wishful, fictional one of things you would really love to buy but cannot right now, or just a very random, disgusting, bizarre, nonsensical combination of items. I'll start with an example. This slide, this grocery list includes a family plan for a very nice meal with pizza and popcorn, although things starts to derail when a child is included in the decision process of choosing toppings, and he or she includes chocolate Lego and fish brain and fish eye to the list. My intent with this activity is also that of reminding you through mindful practice of an action you perform regularly, probably while putting much thought into its contents, but less so on the action itself and the correlated knowledges and experiences that participate in the writing of a grocery list, especially this last year when grocery shopping became an enhanced, embodied experience as being sometimes our only connection to the outside world. The lists I would collect acquire thus also the role of prosthesis of their authors, extending outside of their boundaries in a very analog way through the motions of my own body. They are abstracted portraits not mainly through their form, but because they refuse to recreate the naturalistic delineation of a figure for the expression of the pure concept of human sustenance, both physical, psychological, or emotional. No one, after all, buys ice cream in January for physical sustenance. As a matter of fact, they are not always straightforward records of intelligible information. A recent study funded by the Canadian Institute of Health Research showed that for over 90% of their interviewees, the person writing the list was also the one using it to shop in order to avoid mistakes or misunderstandings. Then what does it mean for someone else to decipher a list? What kind of research methodology are we employing when we look at one of these and decide to draw connections, to be affected by it, to empathize with its authors and create narrations and stories? Let's take these two lists, for example. They were created for someone else with a specific viewer in mind who clearly lacked some sort of knowledge. They accompany the viewer through their analysis, they explicate themselves, they self-organize. Looking at them, I am reminded of Deleuze and Guattari's definitions of smooth and striated spaces, where the striated is that which intertwines fixed and variable elements, produces an order and succession of distinct forms, and the smooth is the continuous variation, continuous development of form. The authors of tend to create order and direction, however, might have actually attained the complete opposite. The tighter the striation, the more homogeneous the space tends to become. And once this is attained, it is apt to re-impart smooth space, state the two French theorists. Hence, the tools, such as form, color, and even cartographical elements, used to impress some sort of order, might have achieved their goal for one viewer, but for anyone else looking at these now, offer a plethora of starting points, cues, and symbols for associative thinking, creating an infinite possibility of connections and meaning making. It is the very process by which the rhizome breaks out of its boundaries and then reassembles or recollects itself elsewhere and elsewhen, often assuming a new or shifted identity. Through these visual materials, we are encouraged to make mental connections outside of the list themselves. The scraps of paper, envelopes, and post-it tell stories through their shapes, colors, herdness, or prolixity. They delineate physiognomies, justify guilty pleasure, explain pickiness, or elaborate on culture or culinary heritages. Their affective charge provokes a peculiar curiosity around the identity of the authors by stimulating our imagination. It is less an inquiry over authentication and more a quest for identification through relation. We relate to these lists, we empathize with whomever wrote them, as more particular be it the actual content or the handwriting or even the medium of the list, move us and affects us through personal identification and through the creative impulse of delineating in our mind a specific subjectivity, which might or might not be the correct one. For example, the very idea of sustenance and care that imbues grocery lists holds strong historical and political characteristics. Grocery shopping still strongly presents itself as a gendered activity, but most importantly, it is one which occupies the paradoxical position of being considered essential and menial simultaneously by the global capitalistic perception of societal life. This has been significantly exacerbated by the global health crisis. Social theorist T.T. Bhattacharya explains how capitalism acknowledges productive labor for the market as the sole form of legitimate work, while the tremendous amount of familial and communitarian work that goes on to sustain and produce the worker and their labor power is naturalized as non-existent. As a matter of fact, as economic theorist Mariana Mazzucato's work explicitly illustrates, national accounts have historically and systemically undervalued specific services, resulting in their exclusion from the system devised for the measurement of a society's GDP, gross domestic product. This, however, influences our misconception of economic recessions and depressions at times in which a society was actually consistently sustainable in its services, and vice versa, the conviction that a society's well-being depends purely on economic factors, which is the case now in many countries. Bhattacharya explains that social reproduction theory refers to, quote, the activities and attitudes, behaviors and emotions, and responsibilities and relationships directly involved in maintaining life on a daily basis and intergenerationally. Grocery shopping completely inhabits this definition. The lists offer an entry point into the discourse surrounding the generalized crisis of care, as the crisis of the system's ability to reproduce itself, brought on by depletion and decimation of social reproductive functions. However, they achieve this by means of affective connections, revealing personal histories instead of official records. For example, the three lists on the slide now all present spelling mistakes in Italian, disclosing a sense of uneasiness with the written Italian. While the two on the left suggest a decisive hand with clear objectives in mind, despite the discomfort with the spelling, the one on the right reveals the unsteadiness of an older person and the relationship with Italian language that comes filtrated by a strong regional dialect. To me, it speaks of the generation born between 1920 and 1930, of illiteracy due to wartime and a premature entrance into the labor force. Then the association of these lists altogether makes intelligible one of the many ways in which the labor of care is deeply imbricated with the exploitative and violent drive of the market economy. I am referring to the dislocation and migration of countless people from the global south to take up caring position in the north, which is also one of the domains most affected by the COVID pandemic because of the physical, social, and economic vulnerability of both parties involved. Of course, to entertain such connections, I am leaving much to speculation and to personal identification dictated by my own subjectivity, my positionality, and my situated knowledge. But that is part of the very conditions of this research. I cannot rely on previous academic work analyzing grocery lists as expressive visual representations of subjectivities during a global pandemic. It is unprecedented, and it would not inform me more than employing the embodied mode of research which bases itself on performing grocery shopping, deciphering strangers' handwriting, and observing and reflecting on the broader contextual environment I find myself in. Another example, these two lists are a declaration of love in the most straightforward and unequivocal way possible. Looking at them, I feel the impossibility to meet with loved ones that we have all been subjected to for the bigger part of a year, and unfortunately still continue to. Of certain bodies and certain intimate relations. During the stricter lockdowns here in Italy, we were only allowed to leave our homes for groceries and health reasons. Carrying with us a governmentally issued form specifying our motive of travel and of destination. As a way to reconnect significant others, anyone had to identify their partner through this official form in order to include them as an allowed destination for travel. From the perspective of the LGBTQ+ community, to make one example among many, this became a risk of visibility and forced coming out, so much so that many couples resolved to using grocery shopping as their only legally accepted meeting opportunity in case of police questioning, which was very common in the first few months, by the way. With these examples, I try to express the journey of my methodology, the way I let one aspect of this visual material to situate itself and myself within broader discourses. Despite employing a subjective process, the lists become portrayal of specific social cultural subjectivities and visual testimonies of our societal shortcomings, depicting power imbalances, gendered and racialized biases and assumptions, class divisions, and maybe most of all during this year, the sheer privilege of age, able bodies, and good health. This exercise in creative speculation allows us to pin down the effective charge of such material and employing it to access the urgent and practical issues of our lived experiences that can then be informed through more formal or academic avenues of information. As Rogoff explained, the aim is to consider research not solely as working from inherited knowledges, but also allowing for a notion of research as being enacted through creative practices. Conditions become the drive of the research, not the subject matter, and anchor it differently. They disconnect research from questions of what sustains its claims to originality and legitimacy, and of how the research claims an identity. Conditions intervene in the false divisions between the academic, the creative, the professional, and instead offer a series of entry points that signal urgency, not in the journalistic sense of this word, but I think in the effective sense. The urgency spurred by an empathic reaction, which is difficult to ignore in the sense that certain events, certain atmospheres and elements cannot be isolated as only such, just food items on a piece of paper, but demand a complete reconfiguration of how we know things. Rogoff acknowledges how research has moved from stable bodies of knowledge and recognized subjects whose validity must be universally accepted. Moreover, she adamantly expresses how, given our conditions, which are now more than ever peculiarly and deeply unstable, the modes in which we study cannot themselves be stable. The methodology should reflect the content and resonates with its conditions. Hence why I decided to base my research on the embodied practice of shopping itself, on oral histories, conversation, and on the participants' action, that is yours, of both writing and deciphering lists by allowing our feelings, our empathic reactions to lead our reflections. This way, perhaps research is able to constitute new realities instead of studying existing ones, inventing narratives, mapping subjectivities, intervening, stimulating, and proposing affective connections. I was not able to give much attention to the chat while I spoke, but if anything was written on there, then thank you. I believe it constitutes a form of viewership and participation to research that is less institutionally located and more interior, but most importantly also is continuously unfolding. It is all a matter of realizing that research is not only about, but it is also made of the stuff of everyday life, that anyone generates research and that we are part of it. Just like my name appears on this list after lard and eggs, and I cannot stop it from unlocking all the amalgamated knowledges within me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ilaria. That was super thoughtful, very, very creative, and honestly so nice to see. So thank you. So our third and last panelist for today, for this morning, is Gabriella Teresa Moreno. Gabriella is a writer and independent scholar whose research in the field of 18th and 19th century art and material culture concerns itself with non-human manifestations of organic life rendered as image. Her current project takes as its point of departure the cult of vegetative genius nascent in German Romantic culture, which itself resulted in objects and images birthed from the pulp of plant. Gabriella suggests that such intermedial things, like wooden books, prefigured empathy as a 19th century category of psychological aesthetics, one predicated on the ability to feel into the material and psychological conditions of other beings. Gabriella holds a BA in art history from Stanford University and an MA from the graduate program in the history of art at the Clark Art Institute. Please welcome Gabriella.
Okay, hi, thank you everyone for being here today and for inviting me to present at this conference. I would like to dedicate this talk to my mother, Gail, who has always filled my life with green and growing vegetation. So this is for her. In the wet earth of 18th century Germany, the birthplace of modern forestry, a curiously verdant library took root and began to grow. Xylothèque, from the Greek xylon, meaning wood or indicating tree, and tek or theke, meaning repository or storing place, was the name given to this innovation in the art of forest botany, whereby a book and its object of study consisted of the same flesh, the pulp of trees and plants. A xylothèque, or wooden library, is not a herbarium in the traditional sense. That is, a collection of pressed and preserved plants glued to a set of categorizing data for use in horticultural study. Rather, and more appropriately, the Xylothèque is an intermedial compendium of vegetative existence, a collection of trees whose spirit and matter, specimen, if you will, were shaped into the form of books, their hollow interiors made to cradle the samples of bark, leaves, fruit, and other parts corresponding to the timber whose namesake graced each book's spine in accordance with the Linnaean system. Pictured here is a volume on the oak tree from the family Vegetaceae. The book is bound by organic synecdoche in the bark of that tree, its identity revealed by the vegetative signature of its hidden seedlings, more commonly known as acorns. This oaken folio box belongs to the wooden library of the late naturalist Carl Schildbach, a menagerie keeper in the imperial state of Hessen-Kassel, who in the last decades of the 18th century undertook an astonishing feat of vegetal alchemy. The tree mystic fashioned a remarkable living archive, now in the care of Kassel's Museum of Natural History, which included 546 wooden receptacles in folio, octavo, and duodecimo format. These fertile vessels hinged open like books to reveal the secret lives of over 441 species and 120 genera of the Earth's ever-growing arboretum. In the time since these trees were uprooted, abandoning their subterranean existence for that of the verdant Athenaeum, few have sought to elucidate their brilliance as living scholarly substance propagated in the delicate interstice of empirical pursuit and aesthetic feeling. In what follows, I pose the Xylothèque as an organic and artistic entity grafted into a late 18th century vegetal milieu committed to a sympathetic epistemology of plant life. Poetically, wooden books operate under the aegis of what I have called vegetative empathy. By this, I mean an aesthetic of psychological identification and physical intermingling with the plant world. In short, vegetal intuition at our fingertips. As wooden books will attest, it is in dealing with the province of plant matter that an ontological transference takes place at the very root of our being. By way of touching plant, we too become vegetal. Daphne's laurel fingers, painted in 1677 at the height of their transition to leaf and branch, picture vegetative empathy with tender assertion. Their gossamer elongation is a moment of painterly metamorphosis in which flesh is neither human nor plant. In the context of art history, these porcelain appendages prefigure the 19th century concept of Einfühlung, which underlines today's talk. Translated in 1909 as empathy, the original German meaning of Einfühlung, much more robust, was predicated on the ability to feel into the material and psychological conditions of other beings. Infeeling, as it was also translated, was the privilege of aesthetically conscious and anthropomorphic subjects to identify with and enter works of art, thus imbuing them with a bit of human spirit. The Xylothèque and the blossoming curiosities I've gathered in its constellation seek our infeeling in the realm of the visual. In exchanges of vegetal empathy, however, human flesh does not impart of its character onto herbaceous life, but rather shifts itself in accordance with, as Goethe would say, the spiraling tendencies of vegetative life. In attempting to feel into the world of plants, we are lent access to other minds and ways of being in the world, even that of a wooden book and the tree it once was, or perhaps still is. In his arboreal tome, Landscape and Memory, Simon Schama rightly notes that the volumes of a Xylothèque are the product of a time when scientific inquiry and poetic sensibility seemed effortlessly and wittily married, the Enlightenment of the 18th century. Although surely a product of this historical moment, one characterized by the taxonomic approach to natural philosophy, the advent of the Xylothèque was, to be sure, an act of vegetal poiesis. Its creation an origin moment in which the hands wield the organic world to bring something into being, to render a soul or anima that did not exist before. In a pamphlet printed in 1788, Karl Schildbach, a man of few words and little education, announced the publication of what he called his wood library according to a self-determined plan. For what purpose the books were intended, we cannot be sure, for the pamphlet merely read, quote, "I am passing on my chosen plan to the experts and leave to each to decide to what extent my completed work can be useful for the natural, forest, and cameral sciences." Besides this cryptic message and a series of notes outlining the height, root system, and growing conditions of each tree, the volumes of a wooden library contained no other text authored by a human hand. Instead, these books spoke the language of trees, employing the syntax of their parts to convey knowledge about them to human subjects. The spine of each volume was an amalgamation of bark texture alloyed with a golden stamp upon which the binomial species name appeared in both Latin and German. At the bottom of the spine was affixed a bit of moss or fungus typical to that tree and a strip of burnt wood indicating the heat produced by its embers. The covers were fashioned from miscellaneous sections of wood, cuts of branches, and cross sections of sapwood. Finally, opposite the spine, in an odd mimicking of human anatomy, was inserted a strip of heartwood. Schildbach here fashioned a vegetal semiotics, whereby a wooden book employs its organic media, its inherently visual and haptic qualities, to convey nonverbal cues as to the tree's meaning. In a montage-like act of vegetal translation and transcription, the tree reveals itself and indeed speaks. In the running of our fingers over the reddish-brown shell of the holm oak, and in touching its felt-encased shoots, we are transported beneath the ground to imbibe the knowledge of its roots. The sturdy, woody roots, Schildbach's short note on the oak reads, do not penetrate deeply into the earth. This oak, rather, belongs in the winter pleasure forests. How is it that Schildbach could hear trees speak, and how is this vegetal intuition also an aesthetic one through which the very constitution of the human subject is transfigured? I would contend that the Xylothèque's effectiveness in eliciting the empathy or in-feeling of its reader is a manifestation of the cult of vegetative genius nascent in German Romantic culture around the year 1800. German theories of vegetable genius, themselves an outgrowth of Enlightenment sentimentalism, represent an understudied aspect of empathy whose earliest inclinations are often located by historians in the mid-18th century, the very moment of the wooden book. Elaine Miller, in her writing on the vegetative soul, offers a useful definition of the concept. These philosophies of divine plant inspiration, she writes, claim that, quote, genius, the human capacity for intellectual and artistic greatness, is as much a product of nature as are organisms, and that the inability of human beings to account for the origin of genius is due to its plant-like provenance and unconscious blossoming. In looking to picture vegetative genius, one need turn no further than to the graphic work of Carl Wilhelm Kolbe the Elder, who in 1800 produced a delicate chalk drawing of the holm oak. Known in his time by the epithet Karl of the Oaks, Kolbe was fascinated by the sacred woods of Germany. His magisterial renderings of the national tree, predominantly in the medium of etching, captured the absorptive theater of arboreal genius. At first, this drawing may seem a pleasant but unremarkable contribution to a growing body of landscape art desiring to reunite a wandering and alienated subject to her rightful place in the harmony of nature. Such works of the Romantic era ran the risk of hyperbolizing the sublime, each spot of ground an attempt to reach the origin of the earth. Yet Kolbe, second only to Carl Schildbach himself, was the ideal interlocutor of the more subtle genius stirring within the seat of the forest unconscious. In 1810, the artist would earn a doctorate from the University of Halle for a series of philological treatises pertaining to the merits of the German language. As a philologist, someone who studied the roots of words, Kolbe brought to light in his image of the oak tree the very meaning of genius loci, that is, the prevailing character or atmosphere of the land. As the genius loci of the forest, the oak inspired feelings of topophilia, a strong sense of place rooted in the German forest, extending through the tendrils of artistic and literary production. Genius loci, literally the spirit of a place, is the philological precursor to our definition of human genius. In the late 16th century, genius would adopt the notion of Geist or spirit as a manifestation of outer form. The idea of an attendant spirit present from one's birth, that which drives inclinations, was appended the ability of spirit to give form to a person's disposition and to disclose their natural ability. It is in this sense that vegetal genius arose in the imagination of its most well-known advocate, the philosophical naturalist, Johann Gottfried von Herder. In his 1778 essay on the knowing and feeling of the human soul, Herder compares the soul to a seed that is senseless to the, quote, impulses, powers, and vapors of life that streamed into it in the instant of its coming into being. In opposition to the mechanical arrangement of human parts, Herder praises the form and life cycle of a plant. With what marvelous diligence a plant grows, loves, then ages, gradually loses its capacity to respond to stimuli and dies, says Herder. Kolbe's oak is a quiet and Apollonian depiction of this kind of vegetal genius. To the unassuming eye, the oak looks old and worn. Perhaps its age is somewhere in the nether region of a 300-year lifespan. How lovely are the twisted structures of its organic fibers, how it sinks and twists its root until it stands upright, writes Herder. Although in possession of a grandeur envied by all of the world, the oak is sole from the first to the last of its leaves. Kolbe's mode of translating vegetative genius is a dirty one, quite literally one of dirt and soot, for the twigs of willow and vine, when exposed to high heat, produce the solid black substance that is charcoal. Placed in contact with the vegetal surface of paper, charcoal inscribes plant pulp with living vitality. In the act of artistic transcription, the flesh of plant and scholar meet, setting loose a crumbled powder of its medium. It is the falling out of this physical and intellectual exchange, the dissipating of seeds, pollen, and ideas with tendrils that connects Kolbe's translation of vegetative genius to that of Schildbach's. In 1771, Carl Schildbach, who I've imagined embodying Roland Savory's Netherlandish masterpiece, The Bohemian Husbandman, was hired to oversee an expansive plot of magisterial land in Kassel, Germany, and to care for the trees and animals that lived there. Kassel's forests were a shrouded haven for Schildbach, putting forth for his investigation what an anonymous source claimed in 1786 to be, quote, the richest, most complete living wood collection in existence. With its mixture of domestic and foreign wood species numbering in the hundreds, the sylvan ecosystem of Kassel, dwelling place to the honey locust and sweet citrus, was deemed by another local to be a veritable botanical observatory. It was here amongst the trees where Schildbach set out to complete his true life's work, a literary precursor to vegetative empathy. Disheveled and by most accounts slightly unpleasant, the amateur naturalist was gnarled like an oak tree. Yet he welcomed visitors to his home because he sensed that his library could and should be useful to those with specialized knowledge. Following a visit to Schildbach's book room, a Swiss student of forestry recorded in his diary, "This unusual man has neither had an education nor does he possess scholarly knowledge of any kind. And yet he has acquired familiarity and aptitude in the natural sciences through his own efforts and without any assistance, such as would make a scholar proud." Schildbach's working method was therefore in alignment with the most elusive aspect of vegetal genius, that is, its grounding in the realm of unawareness. This he acknowledged through the purposeful language of his pamphlet, in which he declared that the Xylothèques store of material would be left to the experts. The hermit librarian sat thusly amongst his books, perhaps looking somewhat like the husbandman, sturdy as a gourd, stabilized by an oaken support, and equipped with a wooden staff to aid in his conversation with trees. Meanwhile, the oak and laurel would go on in an unknowing display of their life cycle, as if still root-bound in their once warm soil. Each volume was accessed by means of a sliding cover, which when removed, revealed a tiny receptacle in the style of a Joseph Cornell shadow box, lined with light blue paper and filled with small treasures. Here was set out for display all the important parts of a tree's existence, a still life of vegetal materiality, unaware of its own knowledge-forming germination. Each volume was a sinewy cross-section of the tree's anatomy. They contained seeds, roots, leaves of the mature, young, and skeletal kind, branches with water knobs, wilted blossoms, and when applicable, a wax cast of its fruit. In the case of the laurel tree seen at left, one makes the acquaintance of tiny clustered flowers that give way to a fragrant purplish fruit. "We value genius," Herder writes, "for its formlessness, and for the too early ripeness or exaggeration of its growth." Such then was the internal logic of the Xylothèque, an unbeknownst and haphazard display of ripeness akin to the mind of genius. In a 4-volume catalog of aesthetic terms published in Germany in 1774, the entry for Erfindung, meaning invention, contained a striking testimony to vegetal genius. The entry's author, Johann Georg Sulzer, writes, quote, "It is a remarkable thing belonging to the mysteries of psychology that certain thoughts will present themselves in the greatest clarity and of their own accord when we are not in search of them. It seems as though in the interim they had grown unnoticed like a plant and now suddenly stood before us in their full development and bloom." Thinking on the dreamlike blossoming of genius, we turn now to a set of paintings which make known the slow and determined reverie of plant life and its scholarly pursuit. In 1701, the animal painter from Heidelberg, Johann Melchior Roos, completed a set of pendant paintings entitled Queen of the Night. The pictures are tall and narrow to accommodate the aerial roots of the night-blooming cereus, whose exotic flower opens but once a year in the dark of night. This species of cactus, native to Mexico and Central America, was present also in the forests of Kassel, kept humid in one of the many hothouses supervised several decades later by Schildbach. Though the cereus pictured here was undoubtedly perished by the time he took up his official duties in Kassel, it is likely that he saw the painting exhibited in the city's collection of public artworks. Whatever Schildbach's knowledge of the cereus may have been, its aerial roots and meandering levity will help conclude as to his method of vegetal translation. In the plant kingdom, to possess aerial roots means to live with anchoring organs exposed above the ground. These dangling rhizomes seek water and nutrient intake directly from the air, from fogs, dew, or humidity. In the human kingdom, to possess aerial roots is to live with one's head in the clouds, so to speak. Man and plant, says Aristotle, are oriented as mirror images. Man stands on his 2 feet with head and mind atop his shoulders, while plants are nestled with their faces in the ground, their roots having, so he says, the character and value of a mouth and head, while their nether parts exist aloft. So we might imagine Schildbach proceeding like the night bloom Sirius with an inverted set of roots atop his shoulders into the night of plant language. Schildbach, a true autodidact of the vegetable kind, took the proverbial book of nature as his guide and object of study. Birthed in the Latin Middle Ages, the book of nature was a pageless concept, a realm akin to that of vegetal genius, in which the possession of plant-like intuition laid bare for the human subject a new kind of language. Though reliant on the prose of vegetation and its meaning, the book of nature needs no written words. Rather, it offers a being in the world akin to the immersive experience of the archive, a sense of being suspended in the presence of knowledge itself, responsive as like the roots of a tree to the sensorial and haptic qualities of one's learned environment. Despite the authority text often assumes in this archival space, Schildbach understood that to simply be there was enough. In a gesture of vegetative genius, and with a willingness to become plant, this odd man shuffled through endless fauns in the archive of nature, folders grown over with moss and ivy meant to teach him the things of the world. Where Johann Gottfried Herder and Carl Wilhelm Kolbe gifted to plants the language of ekphrastic poetry, Schildbach lent them only his touch. In so doing, he translated vegetable genius into vegetative empathy in the sense of Einfühlung, fulfilling its requirement for psychic and material exchange. He felt into the tree's heartwood, its central supporting pillar, and found that it would never decay if he left its outer layers intact. In this meeting of flesh, the fallout of person and plant is not a cloud of charcoal dust, but the essence of a simple man. The rings of a tree, Schildbach knew, spoke a language far greater than our own, and we must let them speak. It is melancholic to think that this unmute masterpiece should remain an unknown contribution to the intellectual and material history of the forest. Yet we might remember that Schildbach joyously abandoned the work of art to future generations of scholars, and thus into our hands these books have been placed. Further research on the Xylothèque must be undertaken in order that we should understand its relationship to the complicated history of empathy, which only became a truly art historical concern in the last half of the 19th century. When read through the lens of Einfühlung, the implications of archival research both in and of the Book of Nature assume an urgency for psychological aesthetics. Though the theory of vegetable genius achieved immersion of the senses and emotions in the plant world, thus proving the mind's plasticity in forming itself to a non-human atmosphere, Einfühlung would require from the object a form of projection in return. This, as the film and media scholar Robin Curtis has importantly argued, poses a key question as to the relation between emotion and cognition involved in Einfühlung as feeling into. This is undoubtedly an important problem, as we have concerned ourselves today with compelling cognitive possibilities of plant language and imagination. But for now, we must follow Schildbach's lead and leave the rest to the experts. Let us instead feel into Kolbe's etching from 1828, simply entitled Vegetable Sheet. Surely what we look upon is the product of the artist's philological curiosity, for in the French, the words for a tree's leaf and a sheet of paper are one and the same. The leaves, so says Carl Linnaeus, are also called folia. Therefore, this sheet of roughage, in all of its wildness, is the most primeval of archival documents. By some alchemic magic nearing the genius of chemistry, strong acid eats away at a copper plate, approximating the absence left in the wake of a caterpillar's lunch. Perhaps it is fitting to end here with the process of preparing and pressing a plate, of transferring its acid-bitten recesses to a woven cream canvas, itself a plant body. This is the most literal of all in feeling. Let us look now to the topmost leaf, so real we can intuit its thick membrane. Through this void, we glimpse an entire cosmos. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabriella. That was so soothing. We need to talk about plants more often. All right, so we will now move into the Q&A period. We have about 15 minutes. I'll start us off with a few questions of my own, and then we can open the floor to the audience. So whoever in the audience still has questions, please submit them through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens so that we may get to them later on, time permits. All right. So in thinking about the objects, whether it's the grocery lists for you, Ilaria, a painting as a physical object for you, Yuma, or Xylothèque books even for you, Gabriella. I was really intrigued by the way all three of the talks engaged with objects as embodiments of living history. And so I was wondering if any of you would like to talk about your selection of objects as this intermediary between lived experiences and theory in the way that you talk about them in your research. Whoever wants to start can go ahead.
I can start, maybe because, I mean, I consider them to be incredibly connected. As I said at one point during my presentation, the grocery lists become almost prosthesis of the people that entrusted me with them. Mm-hmm. So at least for that presentation, I think the object has such a crucial place to like make this link, but at the same time, then my presentation was not technically about the objects themselves, but was about how we research through these objects. So yeah, it's very, I mean, it's not even a question, but it is very interesting. It's something that I've been like considering a lot, because the importance of these objects, technically all the grocery lists I have used don't even exist anymore, because I have to give them back and they're probably gone forever. But for that moment, but they were able to exactly start this empathic reaction or start this reflections that ensued. So they're not maybe crucial in their materiality, but they're crucial as starting points. Mm-hmm.
I think that in terms of the connection of one's chosen object to theory, in the context of empathy, I was interested in sort of its development as a category of psychological engagement with art objects via, as I've interpreted it, via the experience of touch. I think originally it was intended, Einfühlung was intended to indicate like a psychological transference or kind of a deep emotional experience with the object. And I think in the 18th century context, we see the importance of the object as a physical entity. And I guess adding on to that, the question of where the archive might end and the world of art objects begins. Mm-hmm. And that area, that interstice, is very unstable in a productive way.
So building on that, actually, I appreciated the way that all three of your objects or objects of study, subjects of study even, drew from a certain extent from academic traditions. So we can think, for example, of written correspondence as a genre for the grocery lists. We can think of European portraiture, as you mentioned so well, Yuma. And of course, libraries and curiosity cabinets and all sorts of that universe for the Xylothèques books themselves. However, these traditions seem to be reversed or challenged even by all of the alternative narratives that each of your topics have suggested or brought forward. So it could be, for example, by just mundane scraps of paper that are put in the foreground, or the inclusion of organic matter, for example. So I was wondering, how do you personally see the subversion of conventional scholarly tradition in the context of your topics as well, or of the way that you addressed the specific subject matter?
For what Matt, like for about my presentation, yeah, it's the point is exactly like to not fully how do you say, not fully discard academic ways of researching or academic knowledge or scholarship, but it is a way to dethrone it maybe, or to just consider that research is affected by so many other conditions and aspects that sometimes lead to an impossibility of the usually accepted academic avenues of research and knowledge making and meaning making, which I just thought was very interesting as a methodology, and I decided to use it on this sort of object of grocery lists. But I was more interested, in the methodology of researching and how that could be elaborated differently and create alternatives of researching that then can be applied to, let's say, what we consider more art object or any other object, just as a way to remember to be mindful that there is so many more aspects that condition and that influence your research, and also the sort of, and also ground someone's subjectivity. Like someone's subjectivity is so difficult to erase or subdue while researching. And in a way, to consider research in this way, I think it opens the possibility to many more subjectivities, and to consider each object, and then physical sort of object or, material object of art, to be representing so many more different subjectivities, instead of always being read by a specific kind of point of view, or as speaking to a specific demographic. We always have to remember that everything always speaks to everyone, or anyone could see something and draw their own conclusions.
Absolutely. And I personally at least find that very refreshing. All right. So if Gabriella, did you want to comment on this question, or we can go over to the audience Q&A if you'd like?
Yeah, I can do that quickly. Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself. I think, I think this idea of of distance from academic discourse is sort of embedded in empathy, more broadly speaking, as sort of as its own kind of methodological approach to the world of objects and feeling. And for me personally, I was interested in the kind of non-academic or almost anti-academic approach of this man who clearly knew a lot about plants, but it was kind of learning through intuition and a kind of learning through touch. And I think that's something, there's something to be said for that, of just touching things and reading things and veering away from the topic at hand sometimes, to just find yourself in a plant genius moment of sort of revelation. I think that's really a beautiful aspect of, can be a beautiful aspect of scholarship.
Absolutely, thank you.
I think, yeah, that Gabriella's object of study, the work of this man, who I now don't remember the correct name, but I think it's sort of, thank you so much, Gabriella, for that presentation, because like in listening to you, I realized that this man so many years ago and so many centuries ago was like he was technically employing a methodology of research that I was speaking about, and that I've read about quite recent, like it's a recent material to consider non-academic avenues of research. And then you presented this man who's doing it or had already been thinking, as an self-starter, and using, as you said, touch and vegetative empathy, which I think is such an incredible concept. So thank you.
All right, so we do have a few minutes left, but I'll get to some audience questions actually. So the first one is for you, Ilaria. And so the question by Madeline Kennedy says, really thoughtful presentation, thank you. How has your perception of the town changed through the anonymous grocery shopping interactions?
Okay, thanks, Madeline, for the question. Well, I think in a very expected sort of way, it has expanded my notion of my town, which I don't mean in a sort of geographical way, because it is a very small town and I did grow up here for many years, so I knew it in every corner and every street, but it has expanded it in a sort of more, how to say, it has expanded in a more effective way, in a more like subjectivity wise and also socially in sort of realizing, weirdly enough, distances have become longer instead than shorter while doing this anonymous grocery shopping despite the city, despite the town being very small. It definitely expanded it, and distances became incredibly more long and difficult to narrow, probably because of obviously the COVID-19 conditions, but mostly I think for the mindful act of going to someone's house and then going to grocery, which is usually an act that instead we do quite unconsciously or not really thinking about what we're doing.
Awesome, thank you. All right, so for the other questions that we have, unfortunately, we are running out of time, but we will for sure share them with the presenters, and they will obviously help them fuel their research beyond this presentation or even just for their own curiosity. So thank you everyone who participated in the chat and the Q&A. And I would also just like to thank you again for all of these thought-provoking topics and presentations. So our panelists, thank you for presenting and for being with us, and then as well as the audience. And I will leave the floor for the organizing committee right now to also wrap up this session. So thank you everyone so much.
Yes, thank you everyone. Thanks Christa and Ilaria, Yuma, and Gabriella. Those were fascinating and thoughtful presentations and a really generative discussion at the end there, facilitated by Christa. So thanks all of you. This was a great start to our Saturday. To you in the audience who are still here with us, if you wish to attend our other student panels or our closing keynote later today, you can find the links to register in our Instagram bio. We're at AHGSA Concordia, that's AHGSA Concordia. The next one starts in about an hour at 12:30, where we will be discussing alternatives and the futurity of empathy. So yeah, lastly, I just want to thank everyone for attending and encouraging our efforts. We really wouldn't be able to do any of this if it wasn't for all of you. So thank you. Thanks again. So have a lovely day, and I hope to see you all later. Bye.